I want you to picture a quiet room in Caracas. Smiles, handshakes, cameras flashing, a Venezuelan president affirming brotherhood with China. And then, hours later, a shock that ripples across the world. Nicolás Maduro is seized, not by voters, not by courts, but by force. This is not just a story about Venezuela. It is not even a story about Donald Trump. It is a story about power, about what happens when rules collapse and raw leverage takes their place, and about why in Beijing tonight, officials are not asking whether this changes the world, but how fast. China has spent 2 decades building influence quietly, with loans, with oil, with patience, and in one decisive move, the United States has shown how quickly all of that can be shaken. If you want to understand where global power is heading and what kind of world you may soon be living in this moment matters. Stay with me. Because what looks like a regional crisis is actually a warning shot. And it leads us to a far bigger question. To understand why this moment is so destabilizing, we need to step back from the drama and look at the structure underneath it. Venezuela is not just a country in crisis. It is a node in a much larger system of global power. For Washington, Venezuela has long been a symbol of defiance, of failure, of unfinished business in its own hemisphere. For Beijing, Venezuela is something very different. It is an investment, a strategic partner, a long-term bet made not with soldiers, but with money, oil, and time. China did not arrive in Venezuela overnight. It came slowly, through loans tied to crude, through diplomatic language about sovereignty and non-interference, through the promise that partnership, not pressure, was the future. And that is why Trump's move is so jarring, because it does not just remove a leader, it disrupts a model. It forces every actor watching, especially China, to reassess how fragile influence really is when power is exercised without restraint. To see how we reach this point, we have to go back to the beginning. The relationship between China and Venezuela was never about ideology. It was about cycles. At the turn of the century, China was rising fast. It needed energy. Venezuela had oil and few friends willing to lend without conditions. So Beijing offered a different bargain. Loans flowed not in exchange for reforms, but for barrels. Oil for credit deals tied Venezuela's future production to China's growing appetite. Over time, this quietly turned Beijing into the largest buyer of Venezuelan crude and one of its most important creditors. Between 2000 and 2023, Chinese lenders committed more than $100 billion to Venezuela. Not as charity, as leverage. This model fit China's broader strategy in Latin America: expand trade, deepen diplomacy, and challenge US dominance without confrontation. By 2024, China-Latin America trade hit record highs, and Venezuela stood as one of Beijing's most politically aligned partners. But this system assumed one thing above all else: continuity. A government that survived, a flow of oil that continued, and rules, however imperfect, that remained intact. That assumption has now been shattered. And with it, the logic that sustained China's bet. The first rupture did not come with a speech. It came with a seizure. A tanker, bound for China, carrying Venezuelan oil, stopped by US forces in December. In geopolitical terms, this was not just enforcement. It was a message. For years, oil had been the quiet glue holding China's Venezuelan strategy together. Loans were repaid not with cash, but with crude moving across oceans. That flow made the system work. The moment it was interrupted, the entire structure was exposed. Because suddenly, Beijing had to confront a question it had long avoided. What happens when leverage built on contracts meets power exercised through force? Chinese officials responded with language condemning imperialism, rejecting the idea of a world police. Chinese social media erupted, while dissenting views quietly disappeared. But behind the rhetoric was something far more unsettling. If oil shipments can be seized, if leaders can be removed overnight, then debts, guarantees, and agreements are no longer secure. This is why moments like this matter, not just for states, but for the systems they rely on. And this crisis forces us to look deeper at what is really at stake. Beneath the headlines, the real struggle is not about ideology or oil. It is about priority. Venezuela is deeply indebted to many actors across many years. And when a state collapses or is restructured, one question dominates every negotiation. Who gets paid first? China understood this risk. That is why its banks moved quickly, asking lenders to report their exposure, not because they expected default, but because they feared subordination. Under US pressure, a new Venezuelan leadership could elevate American claims above all others. Not through courts, but through political reality. This is the weakness of China's model. It relies on continuity, not control. On contracts, not coercion. The irony is striking. China has often criticized the United States for using power instead of rules. Yet in moments like this, rules are precisely what China needs most. Beijing does have leverage, rare earth exports, financial tools, diplomatic weight, but using them escalates a trade war it is already struggling to contain. So China faces a dilemma familiar to rising powers. How do you protect long-term investments when short-term force rewrites the game? That tension sets the stage for the next shock. The second shock comes not from Caracas, but from Washington. Donald Trump does not speak in ambiguity. He speaks in ownership. The United States, he says, will run Venezuela. Its oil will be used to rebuild the country. Access will become leverage. This is escalation by design, because once control replaces influence, negotiations change shape. Oil exports can be frozen. Shipments can be redirected. Cash flows can be weaponized. For China, this is a nightmare scenario. Venezuelan oil makes up only a small fraction of China's total imports. But the debt tied to that oil matters enormously. If exports are held hostage, repayment becomes political, not contractual. And suddenly, Beijing is no longer dealing with a weak but cooperative partner. It is facing a system dominated by US discretion. China could retaliate, rare earth exports could be slowed, pressure could be applied elsewhere. But every move risks widening an already volatile trade war. So Beijing waits, calculates, searches for a settlement that preserves face and capital. Because the real crisis is no longer in Venezuela. It is in the rules that once governed global power. Now let me bring this closer to you. Because when great powers collide, it is not leaders who absorb the shock. It is people. If you live in a world where borders can be overridden and governments replaced by force, the consequences are not abstract. They shape prices, jobs, security. For Venezuelans, uncertainty deepens overnight. For Chinese workers and savers, billions in overseas loans suddenly feel fragile. And for you, wherever you are, the message is unsettling. Stability is conditional. When rules weaken, risk spreads. Investments retreat, supply chains tighten, energy becomes political. You may not follow Venezuela, you may not care about oil contracts or sovereign debt, but you live inside the system they affect. And here is the uncomfortable truth. If power, not law, decides outcomes, then no agreement is truly safe. This is why understanding moments like this matters. Why paying attention is not optional anymore. If this analysis helps you see the world more clearly, share it. Because the more people understand how power really works, the harder it becomes to abuse it. And the ripple effects do not stop here. What happens in Venezuela does not stay in Venezuela. Across Latin America, governments are watching carefully. Some see opportunity, others see a warning. For years, China has expanded its footprint in the region through trade, infrastructure, and finance. Not with troops, but with contracts. That approach is now under stress. If US force can override partnerships labeled all-weather, then every capital from Bogota to Brasilia must rethink its assumptions. Alignment becomes riskier. Neutrality becomes harder. Beyond the region, the signal travels even further. In Beijing, policymakers are reassessing how secure overseas assets really are. In Europe, allies quietly note how far unilateral action can go. And in the global south, the lesson is stark. Sovereignty depends on who is willing to enforce it. This moment accelerates a broader shift toward blocks, toward hedging, toward a world where economic ties are inseparable from security calculations. The irony is that actions meant to project strength often expose fragility. They force others to adapt, diversify, and resist. Venezuela is not the center of this story. It is the catalyst, and what comes next will define the shape of power for years to come. From this point forward, the future branches in three directions. The first is the optimistic path. A deal is struck quietly. A new government in Caracas honors existing obligations, restructuring debt rather than rejecting it. Oil revenues are split. China absorbs losses, but preserves long-term access. The system bends, but does not break. The second is the muddled middle. Venezuela becomes a frozen negotiation. Exports are constrained. Legal disputes drag on. China avoids confrontation, waiting years to recover fragments of its investment. Power replaces predictability, but escalation is contained. And then there is the darkest scenario. Agreements are abandoned. Oil is fully weaponized. China is pushed to the back of the line, forced into international litigation with little leverage on the ground. Trust erodes not just in Venezuela, but across the global south. This is how systems decay, not through collapse, but through repetition. Each precedent makes the next intervention easier. Each broken agreement raises the cost of cooperation. History shows us this clearly. When power outruns rules, instability follows. And that is why how this ends matters far beyond Caracas, because the final chapter will not be written there. What we are witnessing is not the fall of a government. It is a test of the global order. For decades, the world ran on an assumption that power would increasingly be constrained by rules, that contracts mattered. That influence was built more through economics than force. This moment challenges that belief. When leaders can be removed and assets redirected overnight, the message is clear. Strength still trumps structure, and every nation, strong or weak, must adjust accordingly. China now faces a choice, shared by all rising powers. Does it double down on a system that promises stability but offers no protection? Or does it prepare for a world where leverage must be defended, not assumed? For you, the lesson is simpler and more personal. The world you live in is being reshaped in real time, not by ideology, but by decisions made far from public view. If you want to stay ahead of these shifts, pay attention. Question simple narratives. Follow the mechanics of power, not just the headlines. If this analysis helped you see that more clearly, share it. Subscribe for the next chapter, because this story is not over.